in their industry. My name is Laura McNeil. I am a Sterling Master Examiner, 20 years, former Sterling Examiner Chairwoman, and very delighted to be here today. I do want to remind everyone that we are providing a link to a free downloadable copy of the Sterling Resource Guide in the chat window. So while the series is ongoing, feel free to check out the chat window, download the free resource guide. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to present them in the chat window. After the series, we will have a Q&A session following my summary notes. A couple more reminders. We do record our presentations and we do upload them to YouTube in about 24 hours. So if you're interested, go out to the sterlingcouncil.org and you will find a link to our YouTube series session recordings. During the presentation, again, just another reminder, we are doing Q&A after my summary notes. Feel free to post questions there. And today's session actually features our Sterling Master Examiner, Nichole Solomon. She is a regional program manager with Florida's Department of Children and Families. In addition to that, she's also an adjunct professor at USF. And she is the head of the leadership committee for the Sterling Examination Board. She is actually going to take a very important topic and cover it for us today. She will be presenting Sterling's leadership process. Nichole, would you like to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. Just to check in, Laura, can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
Good to go.
Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to today's session, which is all about Category 1 leadership. And when we take a moment here to look at our Sterling Management Model Framework, we see that Category 1 sits with what we refer to as the leadership triad: leadership, strategy, and customers. Now, for today's session, we will certainly focus on key processes around Category 1 leadership, but we will also see how those processes are integrated and thus interrelated with all of the other process categories. I love this quote by John C. Maxwell: "A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way." So Category 1 leadership, it's perfect that it starts us off with the process categories because it is all about leadership. Category 1, senior leadership, and it's really about how senior leaders lead for the future. In Roland's previous presentation, he talked about, that's the fundamental question here. So when we look at our criteria questions, all of the other questions are really sub-questions to that main question. It all starts with leadership, and it's always all about leadership. Specifically, though, it asks the following questions: how do senior leaders lead? And how do senior leaders' personal actions guide and sustain the organization? Now, oftentimes when we discuss leadership, what first comes to mind is the individual leader. So yeah, the individual senior leader or senior leaders, could be multiple. That's who we're referring to when we state in the criteria questions, senior leaders. Now, the senior leader for your organization may have different titles: the director, the president, the CEO, or some other name, but that's the person kind of at the top, person or persons. Now, what I also want to point out here, though, is the importance of understanding the leadership system. So the term leadership system, here's a good working definition. Leadership system refers to how leadership is exercised formally and informally throughout the entire organization. It's the basis for and the way that key decisions are made, how they're communicated, how they're carried out. It builds loyalties and teamwork based on the organization's vision and values and the organization's pursuit of shared goals. So let's look at a couple of the key processes in Category 1 and how those processes kind of come to life and role model organizations. Now, category 1 is broken up into 2 sections. The first section of category 1 is all around senior leaders. The second section is on governance and societal contributions. So let's start with the first section on senior leaders. Now, when I see this visual, it actually reminds me of how the role of leaders is to create an environment for the organization to grow and sustain. And the output of those behaviors of the senior leaders, that creates the environment that actually creates the organization's culture. We hear that word culture a lot. Senior leaders set that culture. Look at one of the first, questions in the criteria for senior leaders. How do senior leaders set and establish the mission, the vision, the values, and the culture? Another criteria question: how do senior leaders promote legal and ethical behavior throughout the leadership system? Now, the Sterling Management Model Framework, it allows organizations to assess against a maturity scale. And this maturity scale depicts the extent of systematic and effective processes associated with the criteria described. So let's look at one example. Now, if you remember from the previous presentation, we learned a little bit about ADLI, approach, deployment, learning, and integration. So approach, what's your process? Deployment, where is it used? Who uses it? Learning, how has it been improved? Integration, how does it work with all of the other processes? I do want to make one note here. You can't deploy or revise or update a process that doesn't exist. You need a process first. Now, when I think about role model organizations and how I have seen them articulate how senior leaders set the mission, vision, values, and culture throughout their system, here's some examples of things that I've seen or experienced myself. So in terms of the documentation, how they write it down, I've seen organizations talk about, how maybe their organizational senior leadership sets their mission, but how it's deployed may be through their code of conduct. I've also seen it visualized. So on the left-hand side of your screen, I've seen some of these examples to explain their maturity against this criteria. And on the right-hand side is how sometimes I've seen it visualized. So for example, we may hear from an organization that their vision and their mission and their values are deployed, or their approach and how they're deployed is through some of their front-facing collateral. So through their website, through their social media platforms. It also may be deployed through new employee interviews or new employee orientation. If you go back over and look at the documentation side where we talk about the strategic planning process, perhaps that's how some learning occurs. Maybe there are some changes that happen with the mission, the vision, or the values, and that actually can be built into the strategic planning process to review the mission, vision, and values to see if updates are needed. The visual actually also shows you all of the various ways that it's deployed, including the frequency in which that could be deployed. And then finally, for integration, I'll use my organization as an example here. We looked at aligned with rewards and recognition programming. So at my organization, our values are I care, integrity, courage, accountability, respect, and excellence. We have a rewards and recognition program that aligns with our I care values. So our employees receive I care awards. That's one example of how these processes, so things associated with employees, which is category 5, you'll hear about that later, is really also aligned with senior leadership. You also see how category 2, which you'll hear about soon, it's all aligned, it's all interrelated here. I like to move on to another key process area for senior leadership. It's all around communication. And in my organization, which is the Florida Department of Children and Families, we have certainly used this portion of the criteria to really ask ourselves these questions and gauge our own maturity for this particular process. So the criteria ask questions around how do senior leaders ensure two-way communication? How do they communicate key decisions and organizational change, motivate the workforce? And then throughout the workforce, key partners and key customers, that really speaks to the deployment and the robustness of deployment. So again, let's look at some documentation and some visualizations here that may give you some ideas of how role model organizations may do this. So what I've really enjoyed seeing and learning from other organizations is their methods of communication, maybe the content that's shared in that method, the frequency in which that information is shared, and then finally, how is it segmented? Are you being very deliberate about which messages are going to the key groups, your customers, your employees, your partners, stakeholders, collaborators? So here you see an example of an organization who shares their different methods for communicating. Key changes, information, newsletters. Maybe your senior leaders do blogs or videos. Certainly all staff meetings, in-service training days. Maybe you have bubble up meetings or pass up, pass down meetings that really allows messages, key messages, the ability to kind of make their way up and down and cascade as appropriate to the appropriate group at the appropriate time with the appropriate messaging surrounding them. So again, if we assess this according to Adley, what's the approach? How is it deployed? How are we learning? Did we make some changes based on some key information that we need to update that particular process? And how is it integrated with the other processes? Another key process in senior leadership has to do with organizational sustainability. So creating an environment for success, reinforcing the culture, cultivating resiliency, agility, learning, innovation, intelligent risk-taking, and focusing on action. Now, again, if we kind of put this up against the Adley questions, how are we ensuring that all of our workforce and customers are treated fairly and that all workforce members can meet their full potential? I'm really focusing now on that second bullet, reinforcing culture, workforce engagement, equity and inclusion. How is full participation of all of our workforce members happening to ensure this sense of belonging? Now, focusing on action, that really considers strategy. Okay, there's another correlation, interrelationship there. Workforce and work systems. It includes taking those intelligent risks, maybe implementing innovations and taking the actions needed to achieve strategic goals. I think I just listed about 4 different other categories other than senior leadership, but it all works together. It's all threaded. Managing organizational change and rapidly to significant new information learned, right? That's also another really key component to senior leaders, creating an environment for success now, but also in the future. Now, that kind of wraps up the first part of category 1, senior leadership. Now we're going to move over and actually talk a little bit about the second half of category 1, which is around governance and societal contributions. All right, so the second section asks the following questions about your organizations. How do you govern your organization? How do you make societal contributions? And there are really kind of 3 sub-questions here, around the governance system, around performance evaluations, legal and regulatory behavior. But I'll just kind of focus a little bit of our time here on governance. So what is governance? It's the act or process of governing or overseeing the control, the direction of something. Now, the governance system, remember I talked about the difference between the leader and the leadership system, where the governance system, That's really about the framework of procedures and practices by which accountability, fairness, and transparency in the organization's relationship with the stakeholders is ensured. So what might this look like in your industry? In my industry, I work for the state government. We have annual management evaluations. We have boards that review our spending, as a state agency. We have to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. Now, if you're in healthcare, that you might be thinking of clinical governance, maybe risk management and different audits, or, your accreditation, though the reviews for your accreditation. That could also go if you're in manufacturing or if you're in education. There's governance systems in place for all those industries. And again, if you're asking yourself this governance question, you are kind of putting it against that maturity scale of ADLI. What is our process for that? Do we have a process, number one? If we do, how is it deployed? Has it been improved over time? How does it interrelate? How does it interrelate with the other processes? There's actually been a lot more conversation, I think, just out there regarding corporate social responsibilities. But in the criteria, societal contributions has always been another critical component in our category 1. I actually really like this visual here. I found this visual because I think it really helps kind of capture all of the different ways that organizations, provide value and contributions to the society. So the second process under the second half of category 1 around societal contributions asks questions around how does your organization support societal well-being and support its key communities. If you look at these 3 areas on this visual, you'll see philanthropy, you'll see community involvement, and you'll see social innovation. And I bet you can find in one or more of these visuals ways that your organization is already contributing to society. Maybe you are sponsoring events. Maybe your organization sponsors events. Maybe your organization, really encourages employees to make charitable contributions or donations. Maybe your organization or members of your organizations are volunteering in the community. Maybe your organization is really looking at ways that it can be more environmentally conscious and setting up processes and procedures to really help with energy efficiencies or reducing its carbon footprint. Now, when it comes to how role model organizations are doing this, how those that are maybe higher on that maturity scale are doing this, what I have seen them do is really ask themselves some of these questions. And really understand the why behind their community support initiatives. So for example, there's one thing if you've got, employees that are volunteering for Relay for Life, or maybe volunteering at the local school. But why was that selected? Does that align? Does it align with your mission, your vision, and your values? How is it threaded into your strategic plan, your goals, or your action plans? Now, does this go beyond just the compliance processes? Okay, so I know we were just talking about governance, but when we think about societal contributions, are you thinking in terms of beyond compliance? Now, this may include things like your organization collaboratively working to improve the environment or strengthen some of your local communities, i.e. education or health or emergency preparedness, or even maybe addressing some social inequities. Okay, to summarize here, it is all about leadership. Category 1 starts with leadership. Even, when we think about, our criteria, and especially for organizations that are really looking at that journey, the Sterling journey, and really thinking about, even some of those competitive assessments. Leadership is one of your highest scoring categories, and it's one of the highest scoring categories for a reason, because it all starts with leadership. If leadership isn't in place, you can work really hard on some of these other processes, but they won't necessarily succeed. So ADLI, I do want to reinforce this message around ADLI. So ADLI is used for assessment maturity against each one of these processes. And again, you need a process first in order for it to be deployed and in order for it to be reevaluated. Now, how do you know you're doing well with some of these processes? So we have results associated with leadership. Again, if you are referring to your criteria book, category 7.4, 7.5 is where you'll find some, language around the types of results that can really demonstrate effectiveness in some of your leadership processes. Right. It's been my joy and honor to be able to speak to you about my favorite topic, which is leadership. And Laura, I'm actually going to hand it back over to you now to see if we have any questions in with the audience.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Nichole. That was really, really insightful. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to run through my summary notes real quick. I've got quite a few of them because you covered quite a bit of ground here. And I love the quote you started with from John Maxwell. Leadership is about, paraphrasing, knowing, going, and showing the way. Leadership, we broke it into two sections as a part of the Sterling model, senior leaders, and then the second section is the governance and societal contributions, which you covered. Leadership is responsible for the organization's culture, and I like the way that you ended this session in the series by saying, it all starts with leadership. If you don't have leadership, really, you can't really even get on the board. Leadership is a high scoring category, and it's that way for a reason. If you do apply for the award, the Sterling, and or even if you go national to the Baldrige, leadership is an essential, and you must have a very strong leadership system, which I think the Sterling model affords. So leadership is responsible for the organization's culture. Leadership creates organizational focus through the integration, as you called out in a number of places, of the mission, vision, and values, strategic planning, strategic execution in the daily interactions, and the obligations of the workforce. There was one note that you made. It was good to note that one cannot deploy a process that does not exist. Can't emphasize that enough, right? A process is something that's deployed across an organization, and it's sustainable, repeatable, and consistent. If you don't have that consistency around a process, it's really not a process. Methods of communication, love the chart you pulled up. I do agree with you. Methods of communication must be effective and consistent. They have to be consistent throughout all levels of the workforce, including your partner suppliers and key stakeholders, because this frames a communication system that's put in place for the organization. And then just a couple more bullets. Organizational sustainability is a focal point to ensure the organization thrives into the future. That's the whole idea around sustainability, that you're able to be agile and sustain the operations no matter what the industry throws you, including a pandemic. The pandemic is covered in the model, actually. Governance is a framework of processes that form a system of evaluation. So you touched on, as did Roland, the ADLI concept, approach, deployment, learning, integration. That is how you can assess as a leader. You can assess your framework, your leadership style, your organizational model, your framework you've put in place for your processes to determine where you may have opportunities to improve. And then lastly, leaders need to understand how societal contributions help to connect their organization to the communities that they serve, whether they're local communities or international communities. It doesn't matter. If your organization is serving them, they're in the purview of societal contribution. And it does build, this focus on societal contributions does help build organizational sustainability. So I do have a question. On the last slide, you had a bullet. Leadership aligns to results in 7.4 and 7.5. So let's pretend I'm brand new and I have no clue what 7.4 and 7.5 is. How can I actually determine whether my style as a leader is effective? what would I look for? And can you first tell us what 7.4 and 7.5 are? And then what I look for in 7.4 and 7.5 to see if I am an effective leader?
Great question, Laura. So 7.4, we spent the last few minutes talking about category 1.1 and 1.2. Well, we also have a results category that's broken up into different sections that will align with, each one of the other process categories. So I've talked about category 1 today. And in the results category, there is an aligning kind of results criteria, aligning results criteria questions. That would be a great starting place to kind of start to look at how some of those key processes that I discussed, how can a senior leader know if they're being effective in that particular area? So I would say if I was new on this journey, I'm kind of flipping through my book here to find some of these things, but if I was new on my journey, and I wanted to know if I was being effective as a leader, one of the first things I would do is ask. And what that might look like in terms of asking could be surveys. We talked about communication, right? I'll use that one. That's one everybody can relate to communication within an organization. So if, and I showed that one visual of all those different methods that senior leaders might be using to communicate messages, so there may be some different tools, either through an in-house created survey or some of the more maybe formal technical surveys that are out there to be able to kind of assess how well you as a leader, a senior leader, is communicating and getting your messages across. That might be one way to kind of start. In terms of some of those other criteria, we didn't really get too much into legal and ethical behavior, right? But that's another part of the criteria under senior leadership. And so there could be some results around the effectiveness of your process associated with ensuring legal and ethical behavior is exhibited in all interactions, right? So, just like you would assess customer satisfaction, you could probably pull some of those same types of techniques to assess senior leader satisfaction, right? Another way is, depending on how well you're doing just as an organization, overall with performance, that could also kind of speak to senior leader effectiveness. I hope I answered that question, Laura.
Yeah, very good. Actually, and just for everyone on the line, the book you were flipping through was the Sterling Criteria book, which is the free downloadable book that we're offering to everyone on the chat window. And, I'm going to tag on to what you just said, and correct me if I'm going in a different angle, but you started out and you mentioned about mission, vision, and values, which is one of the things leaders set, they create that, right, as a leadership team. And I think one of the ways, when you talk about surveys or asking, you could also look at data and see, are we achieving what we set out to do as it aligns to our mission? Are we getting closer to getting to where we want to be from the visionary perspective with our vision? And then even core values, you brought up legal and ethical. If your core values are to be honest and
have integrity.
Right?
Yeah. Have integrity.
Exactly. You can look at your ethical violations or ethical complaints. You can look at how many complaints are coming to the HR team. There's a myriad of ways that you could even internally source without having to go to regulators or break the law. You could just see, so it's really those leading indicators, I think, that helps us identify. We don't want to wait until the end of the year to look at these things. We want to be looking at our results from category 7 on an ongoing basis. These are because they can serve as leading indicators. The worst thing you want to do as a leader is find out you missed the mark and it's too late to make a course corrective action.
Absolutely. One of the things too, Laura, I wanted to mention when it comes to the mission and the vision and the values, we talked, I emphasized a lot about with the ADLI, you can't deploy something you don't have an approach for.
Yeah.
So when it comes to mission and vision and values, you kind of have to decide who you are, which is your mission, before you can decide where you're going. For where you're going might change based on the changes in the world around you, So that, for me, that mission is who you are. And then the vision kind of maybe sets the stage for where you're going. But that may change depending on everything else that changes around us. So, that's one of those, that's another one of those things when I think about how mission, vision, and values, sometimes organizations will stick with their mission, vision, and values for a really long time without really updating them. And, I often wonder if there's some opportunities there, to update those things and use their strategic planning process and use all these various inputs from satisfaction with customers and stakeholders and employees to really ask themselves that really fundamental question too: who are we? And then ask yourself, where are we going and how we're going to get there?
Right. Or who do we need to be? Yeah, I
Mhm.
love that. Very, very good. Very insightful, Nichole. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I hope you can join us next week.